Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is my final weekly reads for June. I did actually post last week's under the assumption that that would be it for me for June, but actually I've completed 3 books, a very sort of diverse selection they are. So we have a sort of modern classic, which is DeLillo's Libra. We have some 19th, 20th century poetry from Germany by Maria Rilke, perhaps Germany's most famous poet, and one of my read more German lit titles for this year. And the last one I read on Kindle, which is unusual in itself, which is I suppose a sort of memoir by a stand-up comedian called Ian Stone. And I'll get to that. I've got a lot to say about that. We'll start with DeLillo's Libra. Now, I've said before I'm a DeLillo completist, and having read this now, there's only Ratner's Star for me to read to complete all of DeLillo's titles, except there's a new one coming out in October called The Silence, which is very exciting. So I'm looking forward to that. But the reason that I sort of pushed, this is one of his most well-known books, but the reason I sort of pushed it sort of to the back of the list for completing DeLillo was because I'd read Underworld as my first DeLillo book, and it totally blew me away. And you know, it's about the Kennedy assassination, as is this, and I could never get it sort of in my head what this could bring to the party in the wake of Underworld. And having read that, I still think it's a very, this book is fine, it's perfectly serviceable. I gave it 4 stars, but it really cannot hold a candle to Underworld. One of the main differences is Underworld is much more of a wide lens on sort of the state of America and American culture. It didn't focus in on the individuals. They were more sort of whispers in the shadows and much more menacing. And the conspiracy was much more sort of ambiguous, a grey area than this, which is much more specific on the characters involved. And there's very good character studies, particularly of Lee Harvey Oswald himself. So it's sort of great characterisation. But it somehow, you know, this is one version of what might have happened. So the menace isn't there. Obviously, you know the outcome. There's no spoilers in this novel. The most interesting facet of it was, on the one hand, it is a sort of, you know, in-depth portrayal of Oswald, who led quite an interesting life up to the point in which he died. But also the fact that he was only ever a sort of, according to this theory, he was only ever a patsy, and his identity and all his sort of parts of his life were sort of shaped by the conspiracy makers, you know, forging documents and leaving red herring, you know, trace evidence and trails and stuff, because they wanted all tracks to lead back to Oswald, because that would prevent sort of investigations elsewhere. But like I say, it lacks the tension of Underworld. It also lacks some of the brilliant writing that DeLillo is known for, and the start of Underworld with that shot heard around the world, which of course was the phrase applied to the shooting of Kennedy. But DeLillo brilliantly also uses it for a shot in baseball, a home run that was hit in baseball, which had sort of great reverberations at the time. And that opening scene in Underworld, when as a young boy is at this game, at this baseball match, and it goes on for quite a long time, but the tension that is sustained in it is just supreme writing. It is one of the best openings to a novel that I have ever read. There's very little of that here. Very little of the sort of DeLillo flourishes. I did manage to find one, which was actually at the point at which Jack Ruby had shot Oswald, and Oswald is you know, fatally wounded, but still conscious. But DeLillo describes how, as his body is shutting down, you know, he has no sensations and feelings from the different parts of his body except the pain at the source of the bullet, where the bullet entered him. The falling away of things we carry around with us, twilight and chimney smoke. What is metal doing in his body? He was in pain. He knew what it meant to be in pain. All you had to do was see TV. Arm over his chest, mouth in a knowing "oh." The pain obliterated words, then thought. There was nothing left to him but the pathway of the bullet. Penetration of the spleen, stomach, aorta, kidney, liver and diaphragm. There was nothing left but the bearer's consciousness of bullet. Then the bullet itself, the copper, lead and antimony. They'd introduced metal into his body. this is what caused the pain. So there's I think too little of that in this book. And again, just what DeLillo can do. This is more of his sort of one-liners that sort of just sort of knock you off balance. And the one-liner comes right at the end of this paragraph. He walked through empty downtown Dallas, empty Sunday in the heat and light. He felt the loneliness he always hated to admit to, a vaster isolation than Russia, stranger dreams, a dead white glare burning down. He wanted to carry himself with a clear sense of role, make a move one time that was not disappointed. He walked in the shadows of insurance towers and bank buildings. He thought the only end to isolation was to reach the point where he was no longer separated from the true struggles that went on around him. The name we give this point is history. And that's what DeLillo's known for. A sort of short, sharp literary punch to the gut that just, knocks all the breath out of you. So he thought the only end to isolation was to reach the point where he no longer separated from the true struggles that went on around him. The name we give this point is history. So like I say, it's perfectly serviceable. It's a good read. There's no spoilers. You know the story. You know that Kennedy gets shot, although we don't really know sort of who by. And then we know that Oswald, who was attributed to have shot Kennedy, himself gets shot. And that's all covered in here with one version of events. A perfectly credible one. But is it the actual one? We don't know. But it doesn't have the menace and the paranoia and the tension that Underworld did. And not only is there a lack of sort of paranoia and tension among the characters, but what DeLillo did so brilliantly in Underworld is the whole country is this sort of paranoia and tension. That's what he conveyed. So I was kind of right in sort of pushing this to the back of the queue, and it's really only my sort of completest desire that's made me read it. It's a good solid read. It's 4 stars, but there aren't many surprises, and a lot of DeLillo's trademarks that make him one of my favourite writers just are very much sort of on the down low in this book. So, make of it what you will. I would always recommend Underworld over that. Okay, and on to the selected poems of Maria Rilke, which is a buddy read with Lukács at Totally Pretentious. Lukács has read a lot more poetry than I have, albeit most of it I think is by Romans and ancient Greeks, but I think he's much more grounded in poetry than I am, so he was a very good person to do this buddy read with. And as I say, it forms part of my Read More German Lit 2020. This is the 7th German author or author who wrote originally in German that I've read so far. And I was unaware that he's actually like Kafka. He was born in Prague, and his early days were spent in Prague. But he's regarded as Austrian, whereas Kafka, of course, is sort of Czech German. They both wrote in German as their first language. And this is a collection put together by Robert Bly, and each section, which precedes a selection from Rilke's different collections, Bly gives a commentary. But as an introduction to Rilke, because you're getting poems from across his span of his writing career, it's really good. It's a very good primer. But actually, it's also quite frustrating, because you just felt that within each selection that you were missing things. That Bly, obviously he has to select a few poems. He can't reproduce the whole collections that he's sampling from. But I felt that lack. So, for example, the second section here is called The Book of Images, which I happen to have. And reading this selection, it starts off with a couple of poems about, set in Rilke's childhood and his strained relationship with his mother. And I went to my copy of the Book of Images, and there's lots of poems about childhood. And I just felt I would have been better off reading the whole collection, because then the transition from those childhood poems into the other ones in the collection of the Book of Images would have been, I think, more satisfying and more modulated. But what it does convey, this selection, is the changing nature of Rilke's sort of thinking and approach to poetry. So the first collection, which is called The Book of Hours, which are very sort of about his relationship with God, but not from a standard position. I think it's very much a metaphysical position of what is the nature of I and being, and how does that tie into God. And I thought was the strongest in this selection. There was the Book of Images, and then there was slightly diminishing returns with the later works until we get to the last one, which is called the Book of the Orpheus Sonnets, Sonnets to Orpheus, which I thought was very strong. And interestingly, in the sort of preamble to that section, Blythe says the only collection that he missed out was called the Elegies. Quote, this is Blythe: "I'm not convinced that the Elegies are Rilke's great work. There's something about them that is admirable but not likeable. When Rilke's friend Magda von Hattingberg heard Rilke read some of the early passages, she told him that she felt a hostility to life in them." A hostility to life. Which absolutely made me think, no, I want to read that, absolutely, because the love and lust of life from the Book of Hours is contrasted with a later work when presumably he's sort of starting to think about death and all of that. So I absolutely wanted to read that, and I will go out and buy that collection. And I think it's sort of quite illuminating that Blythe didn't include any samples from that collection in here, which he has pronounced inferior. So I'll be the judge of that in my own right. So, you know, his approach to poetry did change throughout his life. You know, he got a job with Rodin, the famous French sculptor, and obviously they spent a lot of time together conversing, and that changed how he looked at the world, particularly how he looked at objects, because obviously he was talking to a sculptor, and how he approached physical material of stone and sort of shaped them into images. So I think, you know, Rilke's career definitely developed from selection to selection to selection, and you do get a sense of that here. I think that is well presented, but it just made me want to read the collections rather than this, which left me sort of, it's a bit like eating something with MSG, monosodium glutamate, and you feel hungry again an hour later. So I want to read the Book of Hours in full. I've got the Book of Images, so I will read that, and I want to read Elegies and Sonnets to Orpheus. So there's 4 different collections I'd like to read. And just to finish with a couple of examples of the poems. This is called Autumn. I think it's from the Book of Images. Let me just check that. Yes, this is from the Book of Images. "The leaves are falling as if from far up, as if orchards were dying high in space. Each leaf falls as if it were motioning, no! And tonight the heavy earth is falling, away from all the other stars in the loneliness. We're all falling. This hand here is falling. And look at the other one. It's in them all. And yet there is someone whose hands infinitely calm hold up all this falling." So I think that's a beautiful poem, and presumably a god or a divinity reverses gravity of all things falling unto their death and props us up. This is from the Book of Hours. I'm only going to read the last stanza of 3. The Book of Hours poems don't have titles, they're numbered. This is poem number 20. And I just love this image. "The ore feels homesick. It wants to abandon the minting houses and the wheels that offer it such a meagre life. And out of factories and payroll boxes, it wants to go back into the veins of the thrown open mountain, which will close again behind it." I love that idea of, you know, we've mined the metal ore out of the ground, processed it, turned it into the raw metal, be it pig iron or steel or whatever. And here the ore is yearning for it, you know, to be sort of repatriated to the earth. I just thought that was sort of stupendous. I did read some of these because this edition does have the German original and the English translation next to it. And I did read some of the poems I liked in English in German. I don't speak German, but, you know, German is related to English. So I think it's something you can do. And when you read it out in German, you do realise that the English translation, and this is not a reflection on Blythe, because translation from poetry in a foreign language is really difficult, but you do realise you miss the alliteration and the assonance, and particularly with German you miss a lot of the fricative consonants. But, you know, a very worthwhile read. It was good sharing our thoughts with Lukács, and I gave this 4.5 stars. And finally, onto this Kindle version. So the reason I bought it on Kindle, because I don't really buy Kindle books, even in the lockdown, I'd rather get paper copies, was that the hard, it came out last week, and I'll come to how I heard about it. And the hardback costs £16.99 and the Kindle's £4.99, so 3 times cheaper. That's the only reason I got it on Kindle. And so Ian Stone is a stand-up comedian. Not one I'm familiar with his act. I've never seen him live, and I haven't tracked him down. I mean, I've heard of him, but I haven't bothered to track down his act on YouTube. And he's a big sports fan, and he does some sort of football podcasts and stuff. And that's how I'd sort of heard of him, because I listened to sports radio during the day, and he came on the show because while he was talking about his football club and his football podcast, he was also talking about the fact he was crowdfunding for a book he wanted to do, which was about how important a role in his youth the British band The Jam were, and they are at the time were equally important to me. I'm 1 year younger than Ian Stone, and I sort of kept half an ear out open, and he came back on the same radio station last week and sort of said, oh, you know, it's successful, the crowdfunding, the book is now out. And I got it into my head that here's a chance for me to relive my youth, because, you know, London, 1970s into the 80s, big Jam fans, the main difference being that Ian Stone followed them up and down the country on tours, whereas they were probably the band I'd seen more than any other bar The Fall. So I saw them about 5 or 6 times. He went to the school that my wife went to, and that my sons went to. Obviously, big age difference between him and them. So we share a lot in common, although he would say he had, and to read it, he had much more of a working class upbringing than I did. But I thought, you know, here is a chance for me to compare notes, relive my youth. And the way the book is set out is that every other chapter is, you know, things that are very different from the 70s, or things we didn't have in the 70s. So there'd be things like, you know, bespoke coffee, you know, houses. There were barely any in London. I mean, people barely drank anything but instant coffee in the 1970s. The range of cheeses, you know, travelling on railways, you know, just stuff that I absolutely, you know, agree with. The reason I watch my favourite sort of retro show where they sort of show 1970s cop series called The Sweeneys, because I love looking at how London looked in the 1970s, because it's totally unrecognisable to how it is now. So, you know, that's about the only sort of nostalgia I ever feel, I suppose, is for London, my London. But then interspersed with those chapters are the stuff about Ian Stone's childhood. And the first thing to say is the Jam don't really make an appearance until you're over 50% of the book in, which is odd. And so we get stuff about his family life, which was, you know, his mother and father basically hated each other, were at each other's throats, which we get on every other page of this book. You know, we get the message, we don't need it ramming home yet again. We get stuff about his, you know, his time at school, his lack of success with girls. The other thing he did was travel up and down following his football team, which at age 14, in the bad old days of football hooliganism, took some real guts, because he used to travel on his own. He didn't travel as part of a fan group. So we get all this stuff for 50%, the first 50% of the book, and the only thing that we get about the Jam, whose lead singer was Paul Weller, was that Paul Weller was very alienated, and so was Ian Stone, but Paul Weller had a way with words and could play guitar. And so then we get from Ian Stone this insight. I have a theory that when you're young, the band or artist you choose to follow reflects your inner needs. No shit, Sherlock. And, you know, this is one of the things I found frustrating about the book, that he never really delves into himself as to what exactly about the music resonated. You know, the Jam were a remarkable band. They came out of punk, but they were really mods. But then they became huge, and for a sort of a politically aware and socially aware group who put those issues in their lyrics, you know, they got to a point where every single they released got to #1, despite, you know, this is under Mrs. Thatcher, the era of Mrs. Thatcher. And they were sort of the voice of the opposition, because the political opposition were useless. You know, they'd sort of, you know, collapsed inwardly. And the voice of protest and opposition was in people buying the singles by the Jam, because they're not really what you would have thought of a top chart, pop chart band. But they, you know, literally, they got to a point where every single single they released got to #1, and every single single, every single single, had a political message, delivered a political message. And, you know, Stone talks about it, but it doesn't give you any insight, A, into quite why that was, and B, how that resonated with him. And the bit I think I was looking forward to most was tales of him travelling up and down, following the band, you know, following them on every, or on a lot of gigs on a tour, which I never did. And, you know, I was interested in that. But what we get are some really rather dull anecdotes about, you know, because obviously, if you're travelling out of London to go and watch the band, there's a lot of time on trains and just sort of kicking around the town until the evening when the doors are open for the gig. So, you know, we get these really rather dull anecdotes. If I can just give you a couple of them. Dealing with a ticket tout was always fraught. It was illegal after all, although the police didn't seem concerned. We tried to find the one who looked the least criminal, because they got an extra ticket to sell, because they went up to down to Brighton for a gig, and then one of their party called home, say he'd arrived safely, and his parents were furious that he'd gone and demanded he return straight away, so his ticket they had to sell. A guy walked past us in a sheepskin coat. Anyone want seats for the gig? Buy or sell? We let Warren approach him as he was the oldest. We watched from a distance as he did the deal. Once it was done and Warren had the cash, we went in and took our place in the crush. Well, you know, what does that illuminate? You know, there's no stakes to that. There's no menace or intrigue, or, you know, it's just really, really dull. And there's a lot of that in this book. You know, they go up to Loch Lomond in Scotland for a festival that the Jam are playing, and, you know, there seems to be some anti-English feeling in the air. And, you know, we get a thing about how they, you know, because it's a festival, you know, they've taken a tent, but it's a two-man tent for 3 people, and there's 3 of them. They can't get it up anyway, and they fear for their lives that they're going to be, you know, pounced upon by the Scots. And these 2 guys from Dundee sort of open their tent to them, say, here, come and stay with us. Which potentially could have been quite an interesting anecdote if you'd winded it out for a sort of consideration of England-Scotland relations back then. But no, it's just delivered really, really flat. But even that isn't what I object to in this book. It's quite hard for you know, on the one hand, comedians are really good with words, at crafting words. They have to be, because they have to make people laugh. So, you know, you feel it's perfectly legitimate for a comedian to try and write a book, be it fiction or a memoir. But then you read, you know, I read a book by Peter Kay, a stand-up comedian, which is also sort of a memoir of his early life. And they seem to fall between 2 stools. On the one hand, they want to tell the story of their life as a biography or a memoir. But on the other hand, they're comedians, so they want to make it funny. So they sort of tell jokes, or because they're writing rather than delivering to a microphone, they don't tell jokes. They sort of make sort of witty asides, or in Stone's case, snarky asides. And this book falls flat, because on the one hand, it's a very uninteresting biography about an ordinary boy that you'd hear, you know, there's nothing remarkable about his life. And on the other hand, there are all these sort of snarky asides which accumulate into just, you know, this is not a very nice guy, this Ian Stone. He has lots of petty scores and vendettas. So, you know, when he just left school and he was sort of training under the civil services auspices as an engineer, he's at this place, and one of the people working with him is a Turkish guy who has a strange sounding name, and all the people in that office sort of, you know, riff off the name into something that's, you know, pretty offensive. And yet when one of those workers makes a joke at Stone's expense because of his nose, he wants to kill him. So it's all right for Stone to participate in, you know, taking the piss out of a Turk because of his name, but when it's done to you, that's not acceptable. You know, one of the things he was called at school was Concord because of his nose. I was called Concord too. I had exactly the same nickname. And yes, you know, nobody likes nicknames that they don't, you know, they don't feel comfortable with. But, you know, Ian Stone says when the actual Concorde plane many years later, many years after he left school, crashed, killing everyone on board, he says in this book there was a part of him that was not upset, which I find utterly despicable. No matter what the association is to your misery at school, that sentiment is never permissible, I'm afraid. What I find, you know, as the book wore on and we get, you know, this stuff about his parents every page, this, you know, he's paying off these scores going, you know, I want to stick my compass in their leg. I mean, he never does any of these things, but he thinks them. And you know, a lot of them are sort of for comic effect. They're sort of over the top, sort of absurd reactions of a teenage boy. I get it, but you know, it didn't work for me. And as the book wore on, I found myself making my own counter jokes at his expense, because it's a Kindle, I could make notes and comments. So towards the end, he sort of says he had a younger sister, but, you know, he didn't really, because she was younger, he didn't really take that much interest in her life. And it's only when they were both adults that he realised that his sister too was trying to escape the sort of constant arguments and tension in the house, that she did all these sort of rather daring things just as he did, but hers were very different, which came as a shock to him because he had no idea. And you know, the comment I put in the book was, well, I'd far rather have read a book that your sister had written than this unfortunate that I've had to read yours instead. You know, another example. So he's gone to a gig somewhere up north. He gets the train back and it's cancelled. So it's like what's called a rail replacement bus service. And it stops at every single station. And he's the last one on the bus as it's coming into London. And because he lives near Euston, where the train was due to terminate, it actually passes within 3 minutes of his house on the way to Euston. He says, "Oh, let me off here, mate, this is near my house." And the coach driver refuses, says, "I can't, it's more than my job's worth, insurance, etc, etc, etc," which I've heard 100 times. And you have to respect that these guys are, you know, they have a legal liability if something happened to you as you stepped off the bus, not at a bus stop. This is Stone's reaction. "I had to wait 45 minutes to get a night bus home from Euston. 2 hours and 10 minutes later, I passed the exact same spot where he could have dropped me off. Prick." Well, you know, that makes two of you. Ian, you know, if the bus driver's a prick, so are you, Ian Stone, for that being your petulant reaction. You know, it's the reaction of someone who thinks the whole world revolves around them. And, you know, the jokes didn't work. The jokes reveal a rather, you know, vengeful, easy to slight character. And, you know, I hated this book. I absolutely hated it. And, you know, is that a comment on crowdfunding that you get anything published? You know, he has a lot of his showbiz and comedy mates funded this book. You know, I'm sure they all love it, because on the rare occasions he does talk about comedy, they're all, you know, that's going to be their equivalent of me following the Jam. That's going to be the stuff they recognise. You know, he, as a sort of teenage boy, he regales the first time he went to a strip club. They weren't unattractive, but it wasn't what you'd call sexy. Why is that sentence even in here? You know, what does it reveal? I mean, you could say it's honest, but there's no moral judgment or moral censure by him. It's like, oh, that's so terrible. It's just, it's in there. It's, you know, it's offered up without any comment. What's it got to do with the Jam, which is what I thought this book was about, but it isn't. It's just, you know, typical sexually frustrated teenage male objectifying women. You know, it's just horrible. And it comes back to this thing about comedians writing books. You know, as I say, you know, they are good with words, so that you think they'd have a natural bent for writing, but they you know, and a lot of them will write down their jokes and write down their, you know, effectively the script for their act. Yes, they'll hone it, and there'll be a lot more sort of improvisations. They feed in reaction from the audience, but basically it's written for many comedians. It's written, but like Peter Kay and like this book, Ian Stone, you know, what happens if I decide, you know, oh, I'm going to be a stand-up comedian? It's that easy, which is kind of the inverse of what they've done here. Although I did do a stand-up routine as a bucket list of mine, and you know, so. If Ian Stone continues to write books, maybe I should continue to do stand-up comedy. You know, I hated this book. I'll give it 1 star. It's very rare I give 1 stars. You know, I normally give 2 stars as my lowest mark. You know, 1 star for trying kind of thing. But this is just horrendous, and I couldn't even bring myself to give it 1 star on Goodreads, because it's going to provoke a lot of backlash. You know, Unbound, you know, they do this sort of crowdfunding. You know, they have sway in the publishing industry in the UK. Ian Stone is a Goodreads author now. Yeah, so I'm sort of self-censoring, I suppose, by not being open about it. But I want to be open about it here, just how much I hated this book. It has no redeeming features. And my original idea of nostalgia, of reliving part of my own life through this book, I realise it's just a ridiculous concept for me to even have broached, you know. Yeah, I was very much on the wrong track on that one. And I will say the best thing about it is there are illustrations done by another stand-up comedian mate of his called Phil Jupitus, who is a comedian I like, and I went to a book launch of his, although I haven't read Jupitus's book. And he does the cartoons around the, you know, things that were different in the 70s, and they ooze class, unlike this book, which oozes no class whatsoever. So it's ironic that the best thing about the book isn't even written by the author. Yeah, so there you have it. Slightly ranty, but also mea culpa. I mean, I was crazy to think I could relive part of my own life through a superficial shared passion. You know, he says when the day that the Jam's 3rd album, All More Cons, was released, he went up to the shop to buy it straight away. So did I. But that's about the 1 point of similarity between the two of us. Oh, the other thing that amazed me was the Jam played 4 gigs in London, 2 in North London at a venue called The Rainbow, which Stone says is his favourite venue, and then 2 in West London in Hammersmith. And I had a ticket for the first night of the Hammersmith gigs, which came after the 2 at the Rainbow. And the night before, i.e. the Rainbow gig, the second Rainbow gig, the Jam fans came out of the concert when it had finished at the same time as another concert happened to finish by a punk group called The Exploited. And the Exploited's fans set upon the Jam fans and beat them up. You know, there was a lot of fighting and nastiness. And it made the Hammersmith gig, the one I was at, so tense. And the Jam also, I mean, they knew what had happened. And there was just so much energy and so much sort of crackling anger in the room that night, both from the fans and from the band. It was an extraordinary gig. And I was privileged, you know, luck of the draw, that I was in the audience that night. And nothing happened. I mean, you know, I think it was just the approximation of 2 rival tribes happening to come out of their respective music venues at the same time. Stone never even mentions that. Now, I don't know if he went to any of those gigs or not. Given that he was such a sort of loyal sort of follower who went to so many gigs, he was likely to, and they were in London where he lived, he was likely to have gone to at least 1, if not all 4, and never mentioned this, which again I find extraordinary. But anyway, enough. Yeah, so that was my reading week. Till next time, thanks very much.